In this lecture, we're going to cover what is likely the world's oldest living religion, Hinduism. Now, of course, Hinduism isn't the oldest religion. We need that qualifier living in there because, of course, tens of thousands of years ago, there were people living in many places on the earth who had some sort of spirituality or religious beliefs, but those did not survive, or they have very, very few followers today. So out of the major religions that we're going to cover in this course, Hinduism is likely to be the world's oldest. How old is it precisely? It's about 4,500 years old. So that puts us at about 2,500 BCE. So over 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. So the name itself is actually much younger than the beginnings of the religion. The name Hinduism comes from Hindu, which is close to the name of a river called the Sindhu River, which is in northwestern India and present-day Pakistan. So you can see that blue line on the image on the left. That is the river Sindhu, which runs through the Indus Valley, which is going to be very important, a very important location that we're going to talk about. So a few centuries ago, after Islam began to spread worldwide, there were Muslims who came to this area that I just mentioned, and they were converting people, mostly by force, to convert to Islam. But there were some people in this area, some Hindus, that refused, and so the name that these Muslims gave to the believers who would not convert was the name Sindhu, which is after the river in the area. So that's where the name comes from. And that's an image of part of the river there on the right. So as I mentioned, 4,500 years old. And what's different about Hinduism when you compare it to some of the other traditions we'll look at in this course, like Christianity or Judaism, Jainism, Buddhism, is that there's no particular or single person that is widely counted as the founder. Now, it may be that there was such a person, but their life was so long ago that we don't have evidence of it. So founder of Buddhism was a prince named Siddhartha, who eventually became the enlightened one known as the Buddha. The founder of Islam is Muhammad, of Christianity is Jesus. So we don't have anyone like that in Buddhism as far as we know. There are two important contributions to the origins of Hinduism that I'm going to hold you responsible for. And one of these great influences is the people who lived in the Indus Valley. There was this civilization that is lesser known than some other great, huge civilizations of the past. You've heard of the Greeks, and you've heard of the Egyptians and the Babylonians, but you probably haven't heard of the Indus Valley civilization, even though they were particularly large and very technologically advanced for the time. And until the Romans, the Indus Valley civilization was the largest Empire. And it's interesting that it is not nearly as well known as the Roman Empire. So just to give you a sense of how technologically advanced these people were, let's play a little game. And the game will be for you to think about these 5 technologies and ask yourself which of the 5 did this civilization probably not have. So it turns out that they had 4 out of these 5, A through E. So try to figure out which of them was the technology that they didn't have. So you could pause the lecture and think about that, and we'll go over the answer in a second. I mean, so maybe you think, oh, you know, they had these tall structures, cities of 40,000, but they didn't have these drainage systems. Or maybe you think, you know, maybe they have running water in their bathrooms in cities of 40,000, but I don't think they had that advanced irrigation and agriculture. So think of which of those 5 you think they probably didn't have. Most people guess the bathrooms with running water and or the 5-story structures. So we'll see if one of those turns out to be right. So before the answer, here is what this civilization left us with. So this is obviously an image from National Geographic in 2008. And what's amazing about these images, or at least when I look at these, is I think about these bricks that were laid and how they survived all these years. That just blows my mind. I think about those steps that you can see, and here are a couple more images. So those steps right there. Think about how long those have been in existence. Thousands of years. They were there many, many hundreds of years before we existed, before even our great, 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 great ancestors lived. And they might still be there in hundreds of years. So that really gives you some perspective. And here is where that civilization is located. So this is a better map than the first one. So that green area, that overlaps with a lot of present-day Pakistan. And you can see the river running through the Indus Valley. So let's go through some of these technologies and answers that they had. So they did have big cities with 40,000 plus people. So that wasn't the answer. And they did have elaborate drainage systems. They did have irrigation and the agriculture. They had the running water in the bathrooms, believe it or not. So the answer was they did not have the 5-story structures. Their structures were 2 stories, archaeologists estimate. So you might think, how did they have bathrooms with running water? Did they have some kind of sewage system? So this image, you can see in the middle, there is a trench for the flow of water. So that's how they would, that would be that's an ancient sewer system for the Indus Valley people. In the 19th century, we figured out what hieroglyphics said, and we can read the languages of the Mesopotamians and the Mayans. That actually came later in the 20th century. But the language or the script of the Indus Valley people looks like this. And we still to this day don't know what these symbols, what this script means. We have some guesses, but we don't know. And again, even with all of our technology and all of the experts working in the related fields, we can't decipher this. So if you would, in a new tab, go to this link, there's a really good TED Talk about these symbols, which is called the Indus script, a Rosetta Stone for the Indus script. Of course, the Rosetta Stone is a very infamous artifact that was used to decipher other languages that we were unaware of the meaning. So you might have noticed that two of the symbols, and so there's the mold and it's the symbol itself. That's the mirror image. But look at those pictures, symbols, and ask yourself if any of them stand out as familiar. And the upper right of the bottom image, you might be thinking, wait a second, did the Nazis live in the Indus Valley civilization? Well, it turns out that the swastika, which is that symbol that you associate with the Nazis, is much older than the 20th century in Nazi Germany. And the Nazis really borrowed it or stole it from older civilizations. And you actually see the symbol in many places all over the world. It's still used in Hinduism today. So that's a symbol that the Hindus and the Indians borrowed from the Indus people. And believe it or not, it is a good symbol. So we associate it with genocide, but it actually is a symbol of luck and fortune. So this is the swastika looking symbol that is facing right. So it actually can be drawn in different directions. And if you look at the top right part of that symbol, it's pointing right. And this represents good luck. It represents the sun. It represents light. It represents growth. And the sun god Surya. Those four dots are thought to represent the four directions, north, south, east, and west. So that is to indicate stability. If you flip the image so that it is facing left, if you can imagine that. So imagine that top right part flipped to the left. That is the inverse symbol, which is associated with Kali, which is the goddess of death. So that direction, instead of being a lucky symbol of good and light and evolution and sun, it's a symbol of death. It's an unlucky symbol, and it is a symbol that you would associate with the opposite of evolution. So one way to help you remember this difference is to think about the beginning of the universe. So scientists, a community of scientists that study astrophysics and cosmology, their best theory about the beginning of the universe describes the universe beginning with the Big Bang, which you've probably heard of. The universe began as a singularity, as a very, very small point, and then there was this great explosion. And then there was expansion, and a lot of energy was released and heat, and the universe is still expanding after billions of years. So that's the Big Bang. That's growth, and that's light, and that's a good thing. So that's this symbol facing right. Now, some scientists theorize that eventually the universe's expansion will slow and then stop, and then this large universe will start to retract, and it will start to shrink more and more and more until it gets to that point that we start with the Big Bang. So instead of the Big Bang, we have a big crunch of the universe, and that would mean death and destruction And instead of evolution, we have the opposite, which is involution. So that's with an I-N. And that is the concept that's associated with this symbol when it's facing left. So these two groups heavily influence the beginnings of Hinduism. So the Indus Valley, along with that symbol, the swastika, they also passed along many gods, particularly gods in fertility and goddesses. As we're going to see, Hinduism is considered to be polytheistic instead of monotheistic, belief in one supreme being or God. Polytheism or polytheistic religion is one that endorses a belief in many gods. Interestingly, we are going to look at an interpretation of some Hindu texts that are seemingly monotheistic in tone. So you can read or interpret Hinduism monotheistically in some of their sacred texts. So from the Indus Valley, the Hindus got gods, fertility gods in particular. And then there was this group that came and intermixed and mingled with the Indus Valley people. Some historians say that this group that are called the Aryans, so that's their name there, the Aryans conquered the Indus Valley people, but it's a matter of controversy, and it might not have happened that way. So setting that controversy aside, what I want you to know is that the Aryans, or what Hinduism borrowed or inherited from the Aryans, is the caste system. The caste system is a division of people into socioeconomic classes. So the Sanskrit word for caste or classes is varna. So Sanskrit is one of the common ancient languages that a lot of Hindu words are written in. So in the 6th century BCE, we see this class system that evolves. And if you think about a triangle, at the top, the triangle is at a point. It's at its most narrow. And at the bottom, the base, it's at its widest. So at the top, if you think about people at the top, there's not a lot. So the people, the 1%, if you will, of people at the top was the Brahmin caste, the Brahmin Varna, and those were the priests. And then their protectors, the security, were the Kshatriyas, and that was the warrior caste. And then you had commoners and merchants, the Vaishyas. And then finally at the bottom, if you had to guess who would be at the bottom, that would be the servant caste, the slave class, the Shudras. And so that carried over for centuries, even into the 20th century. So we'll talk about the people known as the untouchables, which you might have heard of before. The oldest period in the Hindu tradition is the Vedic era. And the Vedic era goes back toward the beginning, 4,500 years ago. And the first writings that we find in that era begin about 4,000 years ago. And they were compiled until 500 BCE. So you see that range there. And there are 4 main Vedas that I'm going to hold you guys responsible for. The first is the Rig. The second is the Yajur. Sama is the third. And Atharva is the fourth. Veda is Sanskrit for sacred lore or knowledge. Sacred lore or knowledge. And each of these four Vedas have sections that are very old, 4,000 years old for parts of them, and then each of them has sections that are newer. So we're actually going to focus on the newer portions of each of these four texts. So all four have parts that are 4,000 years old, and all of them have parts that are much younger. And we're going to focus on the much younger ones because they have the more interesting content. A lot of it is Hindu philosophy, which I think you'll find much more interesting. But just so you know, a lot of the older stuff in the Rig is a compilation of hymns. A major portion of the Yajur Veda are rites, and that's R-I-T-E-S, rights. Not like the rights that we are guaranteed by the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, but R-I-T-E-S, which is the same or pretty close to rituals. The Sama contains many chants, particularly for the Brahmins, the priests. There was a sage named Atharva. So in the Atharva Veda, there are more rites and rituals, particularly for the home. For example, if there was an evil presence or spirit in your home, then you could appeal to the text in the Atharva Veda to ward that evil off. So those are the four Vedas. And in fact, there's one secret Veda that people don't know very much about, and that is the Darth Veda. No, okay, I'm kidding. That's a joke. That's not a real fifth Veda. But that's when I first started teaching this class, that was one of my mentor's jokes. He says, you got to put the Darth Veda joke in there. The students love that one. So you guys, that's why you had to see that slide. All right. So I mentioned that the younger parts of the Vedas, that has some really interesting philosophical content. And the name for those sections of these four Vedas are the Upanishads. The Upanishads. So there are Upanishads in all four of the Vedas, the Rig, the Yajur, the Sama, the Atharva. And you can see that they were written much later, in the 9th century BCE, as opposed to 4,000 years ago. And there's about 200 of them. Some of them are very short, just about a page, and others are up to 50 pages. One of the first things that is interesting about the Upanishads is that you get less of a polytheistic spirituality and more of a monotheistic or a monistic theology. So polytheistic means belief in many gods. Monotheistic means belief in one God. Monistic is belief in oneness. So there are many gods that are worshipped in Hinduism, and we're going to talk about many of them in particular that are very popular. But there is a lot of discussion about something called Brahman in the Upanishads. And you can think of Brahman as the truth about the world, the way that the world actually is, objectively. So we as human beings, we do not see the world as it truly is. We see it through a lens, through a human filter, through our individual perspective. And sometimes we get little glimpses at objective reality. And when we engage those flickers, those glimpses, that's when we take a step toward Brahman. So Brahman is less of a personal being, God. So don't think of Brahman as sort of like God the Creator that many Westerners believe in, but as everything as it truly is. So reality in a not personal being, but impersonal. So it's not a being that's kind of outside of reality that watches over all people and created the universe. Think of Brahman as the truth about the world, the way things are. And there is a authentic way of there's an authentic version of yourself. And so that's related to Brahman. Brahman is the truth, the general truth about the world, and there is also a truth about you. So it's sometimes said that you and me and all other beings are but an expression of Brahman. And if you are not expressing Brahman, then you are expressing something inauthentic, something fake, something not real. So we contrast Maya with Brahman. Brahman is the way things actually are, the truth, objectively, authentically. Maya is a Sanskrit term for false knowledge or illusion. So think about optical illusions, for instance. If you put a stick or a pencil in a glass of water and you look at it from the side, what will you notice about the stick or pencil? It'll look bent or disjointed. We know that in reality, it is straight and intact. It's not bent. So what we are seeing is an illusion. That's the Maya. What our senses are reporting to us isn't this. Our senses don't provide us knowledge in that case, but a false knowledge, quote unquote. So think of Brahman as the truth and Maya as the illusory, as the illusion. And I want to draw a parallel between this idea in the Upanishads and a similar idea that we see in Western philosophy from Plato. So Plato was one of the greatest Western philosophers of all time, lived in ancient Greece. He was mentored by Socrates, another great in that tradition, and he was the mentor of Aristotle. And being a student of Socrates, Plato was heavily influenced him, and Socrates was influenced by the thinkers who came before him. But Socrates was so influential, was so much of a game changer, that all of the thinkers who came before him get grouped together and labeled those who came before Socrates. They're called pre-Socratics, before Socrates. So that would be like, to use a contemporary example, that would be like Kanye West proclaiming that he is such a hip-hop genius and revolutionize the industry so much that all those hip-hop artists who came before him shall now be known as the pre-Kanyes. And from him and after, that's a whole different era. So one of the pre-Socratics that influences Socrates and Plato is a figure named Parmenides. So you can see that name there, Parmenides. So he lived in the 5th century and lived in a place called Elia, and that's what he might have looked like. And just like in the Upanishads, we see this distinction between Brahman and Maya. Parmenides wrote about the way of truth, so that would be like Brahman, which is objective, there's no change, it's static, it's uniform. And this contrasts with the way of opinion. So the way of truth versus the way of opinion. And this colorful pinwheel-like slide here, for some of you, it might appear like it is moving or spinning. Maybe not for all of you. But I intentionally chose that because this is a static image. It's not moving. It's not a video. But it looks like it is moving. So that's the illusion. So that's the way of opinion. That's how it appears to us subjectively. But our perception is mistaken because of the illusion, because of Maya. So here's the influence on Plato. Plato wrote a story about a group of people who lived their entire lives in a cave. So this is called the myth of the cave or the allegory of the cave. So you can see the prisoners there in the center. They're sitting in chairs and they are fettered to the cave. That's their ball and chain. They're stuck there. And this is all they've ever known. So they look at these shadows on the wall that are being cast from objects behind them, but objects that are in front of a fire creating shadows. And because they've lived their entire existence in this cave, they mistake these shadows for reality. So that's what we do with respect to the Maya. We mistake the illusion. We mistake Maya for reality. And so it is our job as human beings, if you're going to be a good Hindu, to take incremental steps away from these illusions and take steps toward reality and truth and Brahman. Brahman is eternal, infinite, unknowable, sexless, without past, present, or future, totally impersonal. And again, the world we know, it's just an expression of Brahman. So we are seeing reality filtered. And the task for the Hindu is to experience the world unfiltered, so to achieve a God-like omniscience or perspective. And this is something that slowly and slowly can be achieved, not just over the course of one lifetime, but over the course of many lifetimes. And that's why you have the caste system, because you will live your life in your particular varna or caste. And then depending on your behavior and conduct in that life, that will lead to your position in the next life. So there's a belief in this reincarnation, this samsara. And it's after life that we learn and hopefully take steps toward the truth and Brahman. So I want to also introduce this term, Atman. A lot of students think that Atman contrasts with Brahman, but that's not quite right. Think of Atman as the true you, the authentic version of yourself. And so, since there is truth in all of us, you can think of Brahman as the great ocean of Atman, the great ocean of souls that make up reality of Brahman. The major problem in Hinduism is not sin. In Western traditions like Christianity and Islam and others, the problem for humanity is that we face temptation and we are burdened with being sinners. And the way that we achieve salvation is through the grace of God. So the problem is sin. But if you're reading the Upanishads, the problem isn't so much sin, it's what's known as avidya. Avidya is the term for ignorance. So when you get tricked by the Maya, that is you being stuck in ignorance. And you want to move away from that, away from Maya, away from avidya, and toward Brahman. Away from your inauthentic self, toward your authentic self, your true self. And when you do that, you take steps toward enlightenment. And so meditation is on there because that's one of the exercises that can perpetuate these small steps toward the truth. So there's an old Indian parable about a tiger who believes that it is a goat. So it's raised by goats, thinks it's a goat. It was orphaned as a cub, reared means raised by goats, believed that it was a goat, acted like a goat, ate grass, bleated like, I guess goats bleated like a goat, and then eventually grows up and finally meets one of his or her own kind, meets another tiger, which it's probably scared of because it thinks itself to be a goat. But this tiger, to help this tiger that is steeped in the illusion, the Maya of being a goat, brings this goat to a pool of water so they can see their reflection. And that is a revelation of authenticity, showing you this is who you truly are, and now it's time to act like it. So let's look at some of the lines from the Upanishads. So these are translations, obviously. The original text was not written in English, but we would have to do some other classes if we were going to learn some of the original languages. So we'll stick with this English. Having realized Atman, which is soundless, intangible, formless, undecaying, and likewise tasteless, eternal, and odorless. Having realized that which is without beginning and end, beyond the great and unchanging, one is freed from the jaws of death. So to realize Atman, you have to realize your true self. So if you think about times where you acted inauthentically, that would be the opposite of realizing Atman. You think back to when you were younger, when you were in middle school, you might have been pressured to do a lot of things that weren't really things you wanted to do, but you did them because of social pressure. So if there was a kid that was being picked on, and to be accepted, you might have picked on this person too, that would be a step in the wrong direction. But if you stood up for that kid because you believed that that was the right thing to do, and you realized that this is the kind of person you were, that would be part of the process of realizing Atman. So that's one small example. A bigger one is to realize that all of these differences in between human beings, all the differences that we see that are really made up and unimportant, having that realization, that brings us closer toward enlightenment. So in that sense, Atman is less about differences and the things that make up differences, like our formless, like having a certain. These are just ways you describe things and people, having sounds and tangibilities and tastes. But when you get underneath all that, you see more of a commonality, and those things go away. So you free yourself from the jaws of death. So death here is the cycle of reincarnation, of being born, living a life, dying, and then being reborn. So you want to escape from that. So that cycle is the death. And what perpetuates and fuels that cycle is ignorance of the truth. So let's go to this second part. As the sun, which helps all eyes to see, is not affected by the blemishes of the eyes or external things. Let me pause right there. The sun is not affected by the blemishes of the eyes. So why don't you pause and think about that blemishes part. What are the blemishes of the eyes, or the blemishes of our eyes? Well, our eyes are blemished because of the perspective that they represent. We see the world filtered. When you achieve enlightenment, you finally recognize things unfiltered. So think of these blemishes as the filter through which we see the world. So optical illusions are a great example. The bent stick in water. We see that because of the blemishes on our eyes. If we could remove all of those blemishes, then we would be seeing things from a perspective of omniscience. And that, the metaphor for that sort of sight is the sun. And that possibility is in all of us, Atman dwelling in all beings. Okay, I'm going to continue on to another part of the Upanishads that speaks to desire. This is another big theme in Hinduism and some of the other traditions that we're going to look at. A major cause, the root cause, actually, of suffering is desire. Desire leads us into all sorts of problems. And so if you can be smart about your desires, if you can conquer them, then you will take that many steps towards enlightenment. Think about how often we experience an internal struggle between either opting for something that will provide a short-term instant gratification versus something that will help us to be better off in the long run. This happens with people who are trying to eat a healthy diet. So we've got two sorts of desires. We've got the desires that get us into trouble, like the desire to eat things that are bad for us, but that taste delicious, like junk food and dessert. And then we have desires to be healthy. Desires that will, that if we satisfy them, will be much more sustaining in the long term. So the desires that this passage is speaking to are those short-term desires, desires for things that people get addicted to, alcohol and drugs and gambling and sex. It's when those desires fall away, that's when the mortal becomes immortal, becomes enlightened, and attains Brahman, realizes Brahman, that true perspective. Okay, let's continue. I might not go through all of these, and I'll let you read them on your own and process them. Yeah, so the number 35 here also speaks about desire, but they use the term attachment. So attachment and desire are used interchangeably. The wise who are free from attachment, free from anger, free from attachment, fear and anger, and are well-versed in the Vedas, right? So the Vedas are the sacred lore. They realize Atman. And we continue on, free from the illusion of the manifold as non-dual. So I want to focus on that last part, actually, and the term manifold. If you break that up, you see the first part, mani, and the second part, fold. So mani, think of it as many, M-A-N-Y, many folds. So if you take a piece of paper, it has no folds, but then you can fold it up as much as you like, and then it will have many folds. Well, we see the world with all these lines that aren't really there. They're almost socially constructed. Take constellations, for example. We draw these imaginary lines between stars and then create these figures and animals And those are the constellations. So Orion is a famous constellation that when you draw the lines, it kind of is an image of a hunter. Where those lines or those folds aren't really there, when you start to realize the underlying truth, that's when you take steps towards enlightenment and you start to become aware of the illusion. The manifold is the illusion. Reality doesn't have those lines. It doesn't have those folds. How difficult is it to achieve moksha, which is the Sanskrit word for enlightenment? It's very, very difficult, and it takes a lot of small steps, and it won't just take decades or a lifetime. It'll take many lifetimes, thousands of lifetimes, almost countless lifetimes. There's a metaphor here in this next passage. The amount of steps that it takes to finally break yourself free from the cycle of reincarnation would be like emptying out the ocean, drop by drop, not with a giant bucket or a dump truck, but with a small blade of grass. Think about how long that would take to empty out the Pacific Ocean with a blade of grass. That's the metaphor for how long this would take. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead here. We have more talk about the desires. Turn back the mind from the enjoyment of desires. That's another big theme. They beget. They bring with them. They produce only misery. Yeah, so we'll continue. So I'll let you read that last bit on your own. And I want to focus on this last paragraph here about Atman. Atman, don't think of it as something that stands in contrast to Brahman, but think of it more on the side of Brahman. So if we had a chart, put Maya and avidya on one side. So that's the false knowledge, the illusion, and the ignorance. And Brahman, which is reality of the world, next to Atman. Atman is the reality or the true self. So here it says Atman, which as the soul or self is the inmost truth of man. So it says it right there. That's the cosmic soul. Next, let's talk about karma. Now, this is a term that you're probably familiar with. And the way it's used in America today, the way that you have probably heard of it, maybe is a bit of a distortion from how it's used in Hinduism. But it might surprise you that the basic idea is still there. So in Hinduism, you can accumulate karma. And if you perform the duty or the dharma, your role in society, essentially if you make good choices, and you make choices that are in line with what's in the Vedas, then that's going to help you out when you are reborn in your next life. But if you do the opposite, if your actions and your behavior and your conduct don't align with what's in the Vedas, then you are accumulating the wrong sort of karma. And that will affect your placement in the next life. Samsara is the Sanskrit word for wandering across, but you can think of it as reincarnation. So you're born, you live your life as best you can, you die, and then you will be reborn based on your karma, the actions that you committed in your life. So instead of being born with original sin, like we see in some Christian traditions, we are born into a life of suffering and ignorance, and we live over and over again in countless generations until that ignorance leaves us and all that's left is truth. So karma is the fuel for samsara when we accumulate, and it can fuel it in the positive direction or the negative direction. So let's say that you perform only good actions. Then you will take that step toward enlightenment, and you will free yourself from the cycle and be born a god. If you, like most people, have a mix of good and evil actions, then you will be reborn a person, a man. and you might go up in caste or class. You might stay, or you might revert back down. It depends on what that ratio is. If you perform too many evil actions, then you'll go down, and there's you can go down positions lower than the life of the Shudra caste, of the slaves, of the untouchables or the Dalits. You can be reborn into a non-human form, into a beast, an animal, or a plant. There are different kinds of evils, and those are going to correlate to your fate in the next life. So if you commit too much evil by the body, right? So if you harm somebody bodily with your body, then that privilege will be taken away from you in the next life. So think of a organism that doesn't have the privilege of movement. A plant, for example. So if you're a human being and you commit too much evil by your body, then you might be reborn as a plant. If you commit too much evil by speech, then that will be taken away from you. So you will be reborn into a non-human, like a beast or a bird that doesn't have our sophisticated language. The worst kind of evil you can commit is by the mind. So if you do that, then you will be reborn, the lowest born. So we're going to revisit the caste system, the Varna system. So Hinduism appropriates this from the Aryans. And it's really the four same groups: the priests, the Brahmins. Sometimes that's written and said as Brahmanas, but you'll usually say Brahmins. You got the warriors, the merchant commoners, and the servants. And the spelling changed a little bit, but you got the four basic ones are there. Now, eventually, this caste system becomes illegal. So it's thrown out of the legal system in India, but you still see a residue of it even today. So for example, if you talk to very traditional Orthodox Hindu families, there isn't a lot of marriage between different social classes. And we experience this in America as well, right? I mean, it does happen, but we kind of stick to our own social classes, and it's almost this invisible force that keeps it that way. So your role, your social role, that's your dharma or your duty. So dharma is the Sanskrit word for duty. And the way you have upward mobility in this caste system is by performing your duty. So if you are a merchant, you try to be the best merchant you can be. If you're a priest, you want to be the best priest you can be, and really be kind, and to teach the rest of the community the truth that you have learned in your studies and from your teachers. And if you're a slave, then you got to be the best slave that you can be. So there are these terms, twice born and once born, and they apply to some of these castes. And I want you to think about how we would correctly employ these terms. So it turns out that 3 of the Varnas, 3 of the castes, are twice born, and only 1 of them is once born. If you think about how should we divvy up these terms? So you might pause there and think about it. Well, it turns out that the priest castes, they have to be twice born. Because if they were once born, if that was their first birth, that means that they were born into the top. But that's not how it works. You're born at the bottom, and then over countless reincarnations, by going through the cycle and over and over again, that's how you make your way up. So twice born is really at least twice born. So you wouldn't be born once, you'd be born many, many times. And the same thing goes for the warrior caste and for the commoners caste. Those are going to be twice born too. It's only the Shudra caste that's once born. That's where you start. You start at the bottom, and then you work your way up. And the way you move up, so the answer to that question in the third bullet is by performing your dharma. It can take many lifetimes. So we're going to move on to talking about Hindu systems of philosophy, which are called darshan. And there are many of these, but we're going to focus on just two. First, Vedanta, and second, yoga, which you have probably heard of. We'll start with the one that you haven't heard of. But even though you haven't heard of Vedanta philosophy, we've already talked about its major themes and big ideas, because at the heart of Vedanta Hinduism are the Upanishads. So as I mentioned before, humankind's big problem, it's not wickedness, it's not evil, it's not original sin, it's avidya, it's ignorance. So I want to give you some more examples of how we can move away from this ignorance, about how we can see through the Maya, through the illusion, to move toward knowledge and not false knowledge. If you've seen the film The Matrix, there's a scene in which the lead character, whose name is Neo, he's faced with a decision. He has to decide if he is going to take the blue pill and stay in the world that he is used to, the world as he knows it, or will he take the red pill and enter a foreign world, but the real world. So the blue pill represents staying confused and ignorant to the truth. So the blue pill represents Maya and Avidya. The red pill represents Atman and Brahman, at least a step in that direction. So there's a parallel between this story and what's going on in Plato's cave. The blue pill represents staying in the computer-simulated world of the Matrix, just like the character in the cave has the option to stay in the cave, which I don't think I finished that story, so let's do that. So in the story of the cave, one day someone who's curious, just like Neo in the Matrix, decides to explore and finds the entrance to the cave and sees this bright entrance, and it's very scary, and it is painful physically and psychologically. It's physically painful, the light is, just like if you're in the movie theater and you leave and it's still daytime, that transition can really hurt your eyes. Physically it can hurt. But psychologically it's difficult because you're leaving everything that you've ever known. And so that would be leaving the cave and seeing the sun and the truth and the illumination. That's like taking the red pill. Many people, maybe everyone on the planet, if you go back far enough, believed that the earth was flat. But that was an illusion. That's how it looked. That was false knowledge. And when we realized the truth that the world is round, that was a step toward Brahman. Same story about the position of our worlds in the solar system. We used to think that the Earth, the geo, was at the center. That was a geocentrist model. And there were people who challenged this, who were ostracized and even put to death in some cases, that argued, no, it's the sun that is at the center of our system, not the Earth. It's not a geocentric model, it's a heliocentric model. And that was a step toward the truth. So many Hindus today are very much pro-scientific discovery. Maybe not all of them, but many, because that's in line with what's going on in the Upanishads. Look at this map. When you first see it, you have a thought immediately comes to mind. You think there's a mistake here. You think it's upside down. Instantly, upside down. I would argue that that impression is one of avidya and maya. Because upon reflection, you will realize that there is no correct orientation to maps. It would be equally correct to have the map like this. It's only upside down because of a made-up convention. And the people who are responsible for the design of the map right side up were the people who were living in certain countries that in this map are at the bottom. But those countries, including the United States, the map makers, the people who had the power, they wanted to be on top visually because that's better. You don't want to be on the bottom, you want to be on top. So that's another example of a glimpse of truth, is the realization that this map is just as correct as it being the other way around. Here's an example that is relevant toward today and is of greater consequence. Now that the vast majority of the scientific community is on board with the theory that human beings are responsible for global climate change and that it is something serious that we need to deal with, or it could lead to our ultimate demise, those who deny it are denying the truth, which is Brahman. And if you look at the scientists, you've got, so this diagram says 97%. If you ask the average citizen, the number won't be that high, but that's starting to change toward the vast majority. But what's scary is our representatives represent a different ratio, particularly conservatives. And you can see that out of all the members of Congress in the 113th Congress, which was a few years ago that one was elected, 127 of them deny climate change. And a lot of them have some important roles when it comes to in the environment. So the leadership in the Senate and the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, 77% deny climate change. So if it's true that climate change is real, then these people have a problem. But if they're the ones that are right, then everyone else does. But when that percentage of the community of scientists are saying one thing, then ignoring them is questionable. So that was the first school of Hindu philosophy, which was Vedanta. Now let's talk about yoga. So I'm sure you've heard of yoga, and there are yoga classes you can take. And just like karma, there is an Americanized meaning of this term and the employment of its usage. But there's the basic idea is not too dissimilar in both cultures. So you can see it literally means to join, and it's really the joining of Atman and Brahman. So it's really joining the person, your authentic self, your truth, with the truth of the world. And there are two things that are of particular importance: meditation, and secondly, these poses that are supposed to be physiological triggers toward flashes of enlightenment. So if you hold a pose or a stretch or a position, and there are hundreds of these, if you do it for a few moments, you don't feel much at all. If you hold it, you'll feel maybe a nice, that way a good stretch feels. But if you continue to hold it, it can be very difficult. And it's in those moments that physically and mentally you are in a much better position to see the world from a different mindset. So yoga physiologically, psychologically puts us in a different place. And it's in that place that we can reflect and make headway when it comes to these illusions. the goal is to achieve this trance-like state where you're one with Brahman, and that's called samadhi. So here's some examples of yoga. So we got bear yoga there. That's pretty cool. And then here's a pose that I have recently mastered. I'm completely kidding about that. I absolutely am not nearly flexible enough to do that, but I would. That would be great if I could. So maybe that's a goal I will take on. Now, have any of you ever heard the term chakra? Well, it's not mentioned in your textbook, or at least not mentioned in detail. And a lot of people have heard of it. It's related to Hinduism, so I just want to briefly tell you what that's all about. It's related to yoga. There is a parodied form of yoga called Kundalini, and it stresses these power centers of the body that run along the spine, and those are the chakras, and there are 7 of them. So I want you to think of important areas of the body that run from the spine, the top all the way to the bottom of the spine, our tailbone. So 2 of the 7 will be the top and the bottom. The top is our top of our head, our crown chakra, and at the bottom is our base or our root. So our crown chakra is associated with our spirituality. The root is next to the earth if you're sitting down. So that is the chakra that honors the earth. Now think about other spots along that spine if you are sitting cross-legged that are of importance. You might have heard of the third one. This is no particular order, which, I mean, I guess it's in order if you, the next one from the top, the third eye. So that is connected with the mind. So that is the chakra right between the eyes, or right above it in the forehead. And then you've got the throat, the power of speech. There's a chakra there. There is one for our hearts, no surprise there. And then 2 more. One that's related to our breath, our lungs, our solar plexus, and then one that is connected with our stomach or the spleen. So those are the 7 there. The crown, third eye, throat, heart, solar plexus, the one related to the spleen, the splenic, and the root. By the way, solar plexus, if you have ever gotten the wind knocked out of you, then you probably got hit right there, kind of above your stomach, and that area is called the solar plexus. Okay, so that's it for the 2 darshan, schools of Hindu philosophy. You might have also heard that cattle are a significant creature for Hindus. In fact, they are a sacred animal. And the reason for this might be anthropological a bit more than it is theological. So hundreds of years ago, having a cow alive was much more valuable than dead. Dead, you would get food for a short period of time, but alive, the cattle could provide milk for years. And they actually browned the butter from that milk, and they would use it for lamps. And they would use cow dung, believe it or not, for fires, for fuel. And even if you go to India today, there is still a sanctity that's associated with cows. And I had a former student who was in the army and went to India in that role and was stuck in traffic. You know, traffic in the major cities in India can be, just as bad or even way worse than, traffic in, I don't know, New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco. And he was in a traffic jam, and when they finally got up to what he thought was an accident, it was a cow that had stopped in the road. And no one will get out of their car or their vehicle, and no one will try to get up and forcibly remove the cow because of this religious history. So they'll just kind of wait for the cow to move on its own. So that is still happening today. So we're going to talk about the role of women in many of these traditions. And in Hinduism, like many of the traditions, there was an element, a great element in some cases, of sexism that we see in many of the religions. And you could make the point that this is much more cultural and about people than it was about what was written in the texts. But even so, the role of women is a traditional role that even in our country was present not too long ago. To stay home, subjugated to the man of the house, the chief male, not supposed to be independent. They're supposed to be the people that take care of the children, and they are to be worshipped. And a cultural practice at the time that probably didn't have a lot of basis in scripture was this practice of suti, and it was a very arguably barbaric practice where widows would be forced to be burned along with the corpses of their deceased husbands. So here's an artist rendition, or depiction rather, of this practice of suti. And there are parts of the scriptures that would forbid such a thing. So people can see this as being a part of Hinduism, but it's really less about Hinduism, more about just people and their practices and the mistakes that cultures and civilizations made in the past. So I would recommend following this link, and I think it's still good. If it's not, then just in your web browser, do a search for water film trailer. Water film trailer. And that'll take you to the preview or trailer for a movie that's called Water. And it's just a couple minutes long. And it's the story of a young girl who's living in India in the 20th century. And this is right when these practices were starting to change. So suti had been banned. But in the transition from suti into present day, what they would do is they would take widows. They wouldn't burn them alive, but they would separate them from the rest of society. They'd have to live alone with a bunch of other widows, shave their head, wear certain garments, and be isolated. And this film, which I've seen it, I recommend it. It's not required for the course, but I recommend it. Like I said, it's about a young girl of about 5. And she finds out from her parents that she is a widow at 5 because there were arranged marriages in this culture, and they are arranged early. And so by some tragic accident, her future husband was killed as a child, and so now she's a widow already at 5. And she has to leave her family and go be isolated with this community of widows. So there's some heartbreak there and sadness, but it's also a film about social progress and changing of the times. So I'd recommend that. Okay, just a couple more things left. And we're going to talk about some of the gods. So all of the gods really are manifestations of ultimate reality of the truth, which is Brahman. And there are 3 pairs that are really important. And each of these pairs centers on an aspect of Hindu metaphysics or ontology. So the first pair, the first god in this so you see the term trimurti, and you see tri in there, and that, as you might have guessed, goes with 3. And the first god of these 3 is Brahma, the creator. Now it's going to be a bit difficult to keep straight all these terms that sound similar. So now we have Brahma, the creator, which is a manifestation of Brahman, ultimate reality. And then we have the upper Varna of the priest, the Brahmins with an I-N. So you'll have to keep all that straight. So each of these gods is paired up with a goddess, and for Brahma, it's Sarasvati, who is the goddess of wisdom. The next pair begins with Vishnu, the preserver. And Vishnu is actually a much more popular god. There are much more temples dedicated to Vishnu than Brahma, the creator, which might be surprising to some of you because you might have grown up in a tradition where you think of God, the creator, as the most important god or the god if it's a monotheistic tradition. But that's not the case in Hinduism. Vishnu is much more popular, and so is an avatar, an incarnation of Vishnu, who is Krishna. Krishna is often depicted as a young boy prince who's playful and youthful, and you can see he's got a flute there playing music, and then next to him he's got the sacred animal, the cow. The goddess pairing for Vishnu is Lakshmi, the goddess of fertility. And finally we have Shiva the destroyer, whose goddess pair is Parvati, the goddess of power. So I didn't want to inundate you with images, so I left off Parvati. And also, what I'm really going to be holding responsible for the ones with images. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. All right, last bit of Hinduism has to do with this symbol. This is the symbol that is most commonly associated with Hinduism, and the significance of it is the Om, and that's what it is sometimes called. And you can see that part at the top, that bit at the top, and then that kind of curve below it, that represents enlightenment. So the rest of the symbol represents the path that we take before we achieve moksha or enlightenment. And then when you finally do, you cross that barrier and you are separate. The Om is something that is pronounced or intoned at the beginning and end of prayers, or if you're going to recite the Vedas, they begin with a long kind of, you hold the syllable of Om, and that's why it's spelled O-M, because Om, but the A-U-M kind of captures the length of it. If you said all of those letters, if you pronounce all those letters, you would get that longer sustaining Om of ah. So the Aum, that's really how it's intoned, and it's also a physiological trigger to get your mind in that right kind of state of mind, so that you can be in a place to be more receptive toward Brahman and to get away from Maya. Okay, you guys, that's it for Hinduism. Remember, it was a long lecture because if you were taking this face-to-face version, we would have done this over 3 days. So this was a week or two worth of material. So I just want to let you know that. Okay, I'll see you next time for the next lecture.